please?
Yeah, Mario, I'm not sure what you mean by not doing it myself. The fire chief is who we entrust to maintain fire safety and life safety on that site. And we had fire department on the site since the beginning, since October the 15th, watching closely. They raised real concerns about a week ago about the large tarps that were thrown over tents and the inability to access. And that was particularly noticeable when we had the overdose happen and when first responders went in and were tripping and stumbling over the lack of access through the tents, the hoarding that's been taking place. A fire hazard was obvious there. So the fire chief gave an order at that point and started to enforce the fire order to take the tents, move the tents apart, make sure there was access and egress, make sure that there wasn't a fire hazard there. That's his responsibility. He's the expert for the city that council entrusts with that role. And they've done it, I think, as well as they could do to try and push that along. Unfortunately, the progress has been minimal. So the conditions, I think, have even worsened. There's been some change, but not enough to eliminate the fire hazard.
Ms. Anton?
Well, it is important to build relationships, which is why, in fact, I've been down to the Occupy site a number of times now. In fact, was able to go down there yesterday after the tragedy and talk to the dad of this girl and express my condolences, and I think how everyone felt about the tragedy of that happening. But it emphasizes to me that this is a peaceful organization. I think every time the word violence is mentioned, it's mentioned by Gregor. But I'd like to just add one more piece of this, which is the interesting style of this mayor and this council that we have now. Council refused to debate. They refused to second my motion. They refused to let the public know what council thinks. They refused to give direction to Gregor and to city staff. That happened during the Stanley Cup riot. It did not come to council. It was done off an envelope in the mayor's desk. It has not happened with Occupy Vancouver. We heard information the other day, but you saw no debate. And that kind of executive...
Isn't the only debate between you and the mayor?
Well, no, because council directs
this,
the city manager. Council has not directed the city manager on this one, and now the city manager is saying she's going to get an injunction and give notice and so on. Do you know that that has not even come to council, Bill? And that, to me, is astonishing. I'm a lawyer, an injunction is good, but I'm also a city councillor, and taking these things out of city council's hands is a poor way to run a city.
Now, Suzanne, the responsibility for enforcing city bylaws is with the city manager. She has a statutory authority to do that with the fire chief and the police chief. And council had a 2-hour presentation from our police, our fire, our city staff on the site, engineering. We had the full rundown. Their advice to us was to maintain the current approach, to not go in and intervene, until the situation worsened, which in fact it has in the week since. So we had a full report, 2 hours, like passing a motion that you put on the table for political purposes when we've just had advice for 2 hours from our professionals. And again, it's playing politics with an issue that's very sensitive and that we have key people on the ground monitoring every hour.
When 3 people sit down and block an intersection, impede traffic, does somebody need an injunction? Or do the police not have the authority to simply remove those people from the street, to open the street to the public?
Again, that we have had a number of streets being blocked, whether it's by people at Occupy, whether it's the murdered and missing women's families who have been protesting and mourning their lost women at Granville in Georgia for the last several weeks for a couple hours of per day. So we have that as a constant form of protest in the city. Obviously, there are real concerns as to when that's a protest versus it's just nuisance. And I think when it's 3 people sitting in the street, then it becomes a nuisance. But
the police didn't remove them. They shut the street down.
The police have to be very careful here in how they weigh in. And they're obviously very mindful of the right to protest, the right to assembly. And in those situations, they make that judgment call. It is very frustrating for the rest of us that when a protest or an action like that can interrupt the course of business and movement around the city. But we have to be careful with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and our police are the ones on the ground who have to make that judgment call, and even when many of us might not agree with it.
Bill, let me just add one more thing here. If Gregor thinks that putting something before council for council debate is playing politics, I think he has a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of mayor and council. That will not be my style as mayor.
Russell, good morning.
Hey, good morning. I was just wondering what the candidates would do with the waste of money in the engineering department. The rampant, just poor management, purchases, overtime, just stuff like that. I'm just wondering what they would do, how to save money for the taxpayers.
Is there money being wasted in engineering, Ms. Anton, in your view?
I do believe we do need to do a review of all the equipment that engineering buys, and you also always have to balance the work that engineering does versus what it would cost in the private sector. It's very important to make sure that the engineering's costs are on the right scale. That will be something that I'm attending to as mayor, and as I said, it's always taxpayers first. Taxpayers are not an ATM for City Hall. You have to make sure you are using people's money wisely. And by the way, on the engineering, as I mentioned earlier, you've got to keep the sidewalks fixed. I met an old fellow in Chinatown the other day who'd rolled over on his scooter because the road was in disrepair, the crossing was in disrepair. That has to be a priority, to keep up our fundamental services, our fundamental engineering services in the city. To do it wisely, though, which I think is the question here, is extremely important to do it efficiently and wisely with people's money.
But has it been inefficient? The caller suggests taxpayer money is being wasted.
I'm not going to draw that conclusion, but I do think that the point he raises is a good one, and you need to be able to review it, and you need to be able to justify the expenditures that the city is making.
Yeah, it's a good point from Russell, and unfortunately, the past NPA council paid no attention to this kind of management. They were not business oriented, and I think we'd be back into that with Suzanne, who does not have business experience. We brought in a top to bottom audit of city operations at the beginning of our term 3 years ago. We've had a Vancouver services review looking at efficiencies across all departments and consolidating our 8 IT departments under the NPA down to 1, consolidating a couple of garbage pickups into one unit, looking at the efficiencies in the system, and particularly with purchasing. Russell mentioned the purchasing efficiency. We now have one single purchasing desk that buys for all the departments. Instead of everyone off on their own, we now have reporting every quarter on our capital budgets, which was never in place before. We get an annual report under the NPA about what capital projects had gone over budget. Now we're holding it close and making sure that it's monitored and transparent, and all of these projects are managed carefully.
Richard, good morning.
Good morning. I've been following civic politics for over 25 years in this city, and I'm in a dilemma as a voter because both sides are heavily funded by the development community, but I've seen more negative changes from the left side of council in terms of residential neighborhoods than I ever had from the MPA. Good old Harry Rankin once said, that what the problem in this city is that the public hearing process is the glazing on already made decisions. And I must thank the left side of council for bringing in the Vancouver Special a long time ago, imposing laneway housing on neighborhoods. And even though we had a city plan process that said that neighborhoods could decide whether they would have the secondary suites in their neighborhoods, the left side of council basically imposed secondary suites on every goddamn neighborhood in this city. But anyways, I would like Ms. Anton to articulate whether we're going to have a little bit more ratepayer grassroots politics in this city about, the property owners in this city being able to decide the future of their neighborhoods. And the reason why I was turned off by the MPA in the past was because of Sam Sullivan's blind faith judgment that eco-density would supersede whatever neighborhoods wanted in this city.
Thank you, Richard.
Neighborhoods first, and listening to neighborhoods, absolutely. We've had neighborhood teams. We had some city plan visions, and there were neighborhood teams, engaged volunteers in the neighborhoods who helped the city with advice. They got funding and they got staff. That funding and that staff have been reduced almost completely under this council. I intend to put the funding back, I intend to put the staffing back so that those neighborhood voices can truly help us with advice, because really neighborhoods do know the best thing for their own neighborhoods. They know the transportation, they know the housing. I think one of the things the caller...
They often don't want any change. And Richard, I believe, is one of those people who doesn't want to see any density issues addressed. He doesn't want lane houses. He doesn't like secondary suites. He wants to stay in the 50s.
Let me come to that. We do need housing supply in Vancouver. We have a lot of immigrants coming to Canada, moving to Vancouver. We have a lot of people from across Canada and across BC moving to Vancouver. You need to increase housing supply, but you need more certainty. And I think the point that a lot of the neighborhoods are making is they don't like the spot rezonings. They don't like the uncertainty. Our NPA proposal is make more zoning policy around the city, arterial streets, the major intersections, and allow more freedom to develop in those sites. Gregor and his team, for example, want Oak Ridge to be 12 stories. Well, if you keep a major center like Oak Ridge at 12 stories, you don't get anywhere in your housing supply. You have to take advantages of the places you can take advantage of and free up supply in the city. That's how you get housing. That's how you get housing affordability, and that's how you get predictability, which I think is what Richard is raising.
Mr. Robertson, why is 12 stories better than 20 stories?
Well, it depends. It's all site specific, and obviously we need a lot more housing built in the city. We have an affordability crisis. I don't know where my kids are going to live in this city now. It's very difficult for people to buy into the market, and we have to address that with a broad strategy that's not just counting on the market. And it's fascinating to hear Suzanne say we have to count on the market. That's her plan for housing in the city, affordable or otherwise, is just crank the market, rely on the market to do it. And then she says it's up to the neighborhoods. Well, that doesn't wash. We if you look at the NPA history, doing one neighborhood at a time over decades on the planning side with local plans has put us into this predicament where several neighborhoods around the city, like the West End, like Grandview Woodlands, like Marpole, were not given a local area plan. They didn't get to go through that. We have passed at council. Now we're doing 4 at the same time across the city because we want to enable the neighborhoods to shape that development. The development's got to happen. The voice has to be there from the neighborhoods, and we have to be creative about where that happens, not just assume the market's going to solve it.
What can you do to try to address the issue of offshore money coming in and buying up not only one house but 2 or 3 houses? In many cases, we are told that nobody's living in them. Should there be a residency requirements, or should there be taxation measures taken to address people who are simply speculating in a hot market?
That's a good question because we are definitely feeling the pressure in the market from overseas investment into Vancouver. That said, we want investment. We want our city to benefit from new immigrants and from the investment that comes along. So I considered this quite seriously 3 years ago and looked at other cities around the world, in France and Australia, where they do have a different approach, and investment-related properties are taxed at a higher rate. My sense, though, continues to be that we don't address it that way, that we keep an eye on this. We don't move forward with that kind of approach. We focus on the supply side. We focus on more innovative ways to build housing and get at the affordability question. Build rental housing that doesn't require big parking garages that no one uses. We need to take those kind of approaches rather than bring in a tax or something that actually pushes away investment in Vancouver.
Ms. Anton.
Yeah, I do not support restricting investment. In fact, most of the investors do have a connection to Vancouver in one way or another. Family is here. There is generally a connection. And by the way, those investors are what is bringing our supply of rental housing on. There's a building, the downtown towers that are being built now, 3/4 of them may be rented. A lot of that is investor-driven, investor-owned condos that people are renting, and that is our rental housing bill. It does not need a taxpayer subsidy, and people like to live in it. It's downtown. They're nice. They're new. It's a very good source of rental housing.
Maria. Maria, go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
My 47-year-old handicapped brother has been on BC Housing's list for 2 years now. Because he's on disability, he only gets $375 per month, so that's his only alternative. Now he's going to be homeless as of December 1st. And where does he go?
Where does he go?
It's a really tough predicament that many people are facing in Vancouver and across the province. And there are big waiting lists with BC Housing right now. The shelter allowance at $375 hasn't gone up for so many years, in huge contrast to the value of land, the cost of renting a place in Vancouver in particular. So this gets at the affordability crunch that we face, and this is why we need to focus on lower income housing. We need to focus on affordability. We have done a number of things, and although a previous caller didn't agree with laneway housing, it creates a new supply of rental housing that is more affordable. With the programs that we've had to get rental housing built for the first time in years, or co-op, first co-op in 10 years, those are the approaches that will get more affordable housing in the mix and more supply available. BC Housing has put a rent supplement on the table over the past number of years that has been helpful, but the supply is a real issue, and the fact that we don't have enough, and BC Housing is not filling that gap fast enough.
But when you tried to incentive developers to build rental housing, you got pushback from that. from the residents in the West End.
On a certain project, we did, and
Their project.
yeah, but we have over 500 units being built right now under that program, and another 500 that are in the pipeline. So that's 1,000 units of rental